Let me start with a disclaimer that if you watch anything in this video and you disagree, that's perfectly fine. Or if you have very different needs out of a camera, that's perfectly fine too. This might not be the best recommendation, but here are some things I have found over the past couple years of changing cameras far too many times and buying, selling, all that kind of stuff. So to begin, just a quick rundown of the cameras I have owned since 2017, 2018, when I started investigating, what if I get into video or what if I change camera systems. I started with a Nikon D3300 and I just had the 1855 kit lens and a 35mm f1.8 portrait lens, all around prime lens. And that was 2.5 years, 3 years that I owned that one. Worked perfectly fine, was a great way to start, had great image quality for the price. From there, if you watch some of my older videos, I looked into what I could do for video or what I would need for video, and that led me to the Canon 77D, which is kind of like the T7i, and that was the first step out of my first camera into something different. Following that is where things get interesting though. I had the 77D, I ended up switching to a Fuji X-T20, switched back to the 77D, switched from there to the Canon M50, which I'll talk more about in a moment, back to an X-T20, to a Panasonic G85, from there back to a Canon M50, from there I think I had another X-T20. I've had 3 X-T20s, 4 Canon M50s, 3 Panasonic G85s, 2 Panasonic GX85s, which are a little bit different. I'm filming this on an M100 right now, but I'll explain that in a moment. I did have an M200 briefly, but really I just bought that for a lens kit that I got with it and ended up selling the camera off. But all this to say, I've owned far too many cameras, fully admit that. I've owned far too many camera systems. I've had the gas thing. I've spent way too much time researching and wanting something other than what I have in my hands already. However, coming back to a Canon M50 for the 4th time now, and this being the camera I've owned the longest, other than the Nikon that I started with and had for a number of years, the M50 is the camera that I've taken the most photos with, taken on the most trips, used the most for video. I have the most experience with this camera and this system in general. And really what I wanted to share with you is that I truly believe, your opinion can differ, but I truly believe that the Canon M50 is the best bang for your buck, the best all-around value if you are going to spend about $1,000 on something to shoot both photo and video, or for that matter, just photo. This camera will do some incredible things for you and will make learning photography, if you're not familiar with photography, a lot easier. And then if you are already intermediate level and you're looking to grow your skills a little bit and grow your lens lineup and that sort of thing, this still provides a lot of growth. Let me make this disclaimer before I get into any of the pricing or kit or the lens options I have. Everything that I'm quoting, everything that I have bought and sold, I bought used. I think at this age, for this camera and for these lenses, there's no reason to buy them new. Through eBay or through KEH, there's all these different websites where you can buy used, and you do have some sort of guarantee as to the quality, and the value of it doesn't necessarily change having bought it used. So this is the Canon M50. I bought this for $450 plus shipping, let's say $500 used off eBay. And that's about what I've spent for this is my 4th one. That's what I spent for each of them. About $450 used plus shipping here or there. This one came with an extra battery, but more or less, let's say $500 shipped for the camera and the kit lens, and maybe a spare battery. You're getting something that shoots 1080p video. Don't consider this a 4K video camera. The 4K is incredibly cropped and the focus is worthless, so 1080p video. Right now I'm shooting on the M100 with autofocus. Canon's dual pixel autofocus is great. It's going to find your face and it's going to keep your face in focus, even if you've got a portrait lens with a blurrier background on it. You've got one control dial. That's one of the downsides, but honestly it hasn't been a huge deal. One control dial to change your shutter speed, aperture, ISO, etc. Very simple, basically exclusively right-handed controls, which honestly I prefer. I've had cameras, as I mentioned, many cameras, and a lot of them have a control dial or two on the left side or buttons on the left side of the body. And while it's nice to have those extra controls, being able to do everything, including turn it on and off with your right hand, is nice for walking around and just picking the camera up, taking a photo. Now the reason that I say this is the best kit for under $1,000, and I do specify kit, not just camera, is that this ecosystem, you know, just like Apple versus Android or just PC versus Mac, whatever it might be, you're buying into an ecosystem. Once you've got this camera, it's great that you can change lenses, you know, put on a portrait lens or a zoom lens or whatever, but you are going to have to spend money on each of those lenses as well. And where I've run into problems with Fuji, with Panasonic, with Nikon, why I've tried Sony but haven't even bought one myself, is that once you look at those lenses, once you start talking about buying a zoom lens, like a telephoto zoom lens, a wide angle lens, a portrait lens, you really start racking up money quick. Versus Canon, like it or hate it, they have some great cheap glass. So that's the camera. Let me show you just a quick rundown on my lenses. And this is about all the info I'm going to give you in this video, because I could do a separate review on each of these items if you're interested. But I've got the camera. The only other native lens I have, as in the only other EFM or specifically designed for that camera that I have, is the 22mm pancake lens that I got a bunch of mud on earlier today. But this lens is, as you can see, tiny. It has a f2.0 aperture, so 22mm is a 35mm full frame equivalent, roughly, and an f2 aperture, just over f3, gives you some decent blurred out backgrounds. I wouldn't consider it a portrait lens by any means, but I've taken photos of people and really enjoyed it, and it gives you enough width to be able to kind of move around into space and get the photos you're looking for. I'll show you why I love this lens other than the f2 aperture. Once you put it on the camera, you have something that is ridiculously small and very high image quality. So Canon M50 is a very small lens. I'm 6'1", so my hands are a little bit bigger, but very small lens. And you got this thing around your neck on a strap or whatever, you're really not going to care that it's there, but you still get plenty of performance out of it. And it has a close focusing distance, so you can get nice and close to flowers like I showed in some of the B-roll here. But anyway, all around great lens. No matter what lenses you need on top of the kit lens, I would highly recommend including this. And this is about 150 bucks used. So for the money, you're getting some great performance. And to just kind of draw attention to what I'm talking about with these other systems being more expensive, a similar lens with actually a darker aperture and worse autofocus from Panasonic or Olympus, you're talking minimum of about $180 to $200. So more expensive, darker, worse performing, and it's on a camera that has worse autofocus to begin with. That doesn't make sense. Fuji, same thing. You're talking like $250 to $300 to get something with similar performance, and it doesn't click in my mind. I don't know why you would do that. So first lens there. Second lens, and I have the adapter on it right now, is the Canon EF. So that's not specifically designed for this camera. The EF 50mm f1.8 STM, specifically the STM is more of the updated model. And this lens, I'll show you by itself, it's a pretty small lens given what it does. And on this camera, it works out to be about an 85mm focal length, which is good for like waist up portraits or even a little bit wider portraits. It will give you that nice blurry background that everybody likes. And with an f1.8 aperture, it's plenty bright, it's plenty gives you plenty of background separation. And even with the adapter on it, which I'll speak a little bit more about in a moment, even with the adapter on it, you're talking about a pretty small kit overall. This lens with the adapter is a little bit bigger than if you just bought a lens specifically for this mount, and there are some aftermarket options from Sigma and Viltrox, but with the adapter, you're talking $40 for the adapter, let's say $100 used for the lens, or even cheaper for the lens. So 150 bucks all in for an f1.8 50mm or 85mm equivalent portrait lens. That's a pretty good deal. Talk about any of the other brands, whether it be Panasonic or Fuji, from my particular experience, minimum of about $300. $250 if you're cheap, $300 for the same thing. And on micro four thirds on the Panasonic system, it'll actually be a little bit worse performing in low light. So that's an important lens. And then finally, this is all I've got with me right now, or this is all I've got in my kit right now, is the Canon EFS 55 to 250mm IS STM. Again, the STM version is updated. It's got better autofocus and also has better optics. This is the biggest lens, as you can see. Once it's extended, it's a pretty large lens. However, in the grand scheme, once you consider the crop factor, you're looking at something like a 990 millimeter to about 400 millimeter lens. So let's say 100 to 400. If you looked at a full frame equivalent of this, it'd be huge. Obviously, it'd be better performing in low light and all that, but it'd be huge. And if you look at a micro four thirds equivalent, you're spending way more money because you can get one of these used about $100, and again, $40 for the adapter, or if you've already got it because of the 50 millimeter lens, no extra charge there. So say 140, 150 bucks for this right here. And here's some sample photos. I've really enjoyed using this, and to be honest, I've owned 3 or 4 of these as well. Let me show you what it looks like on the M50. Just give you a size comparison. This, again, is the biggest lens, so it does feel a little bit less confident to hold it. But honestly, there's a little bit of a grip on the M50, and the lens is still totally manageable. It's really light because it's plastic. So fully extended, that's what you're looking at, but really well built, performs great. The image stabilization's great. I think it's rated for 4 stops. I can take some really slow shutter speed photos, and autofocus is great and all that. So I honestly use this probably almost as often as any other lens, even though it is such a long zoom lens, because I enjoy taking bird photos and landscape photos where you got the telephoto perspective. There's a native zoom lens. Honestly, wouldn't recommend it. It's a 50 to 200 or 55 to 200, and has worse performing optics, and the aperture's smaller, and it's more expensive. It is a smaller lens overall, but if you're going to use a zoom lens, you may as well get a zoom lens. It's actually going to zoom plenty far. There, of course, with this adapter, you could use full frame glass as well. So if you're really looking to do some bird photos or some wildlife or whatever, you could get something like the Canon 100 to 400 or the Sigma or Tamron 150 to 600, and then you're talking really long reach in a still relatively affordable package. For the money, if you've got about $1,000 to spend and you want to do it all kit, I cannot find a better kit than this. Trust me, I've tried. I would like over time to invest a little bit more money, and if I could get to about $2,000, that might change. Maybe I start looking at full frame, maybe I start looking back into the Fuji system or something like that. But at each equivalent focal length, that is just a standard kit zoom, a portrait lens, and a zoom lens, or a telephoto lens, and for that matter also an ultra wide lens, you can't find anything that's a better deal than this. I've used plenty of micro four thirds, I've used plenty of other APS-C, and I've looked into full frame. Don't even try it. But for the money, it's hard to beat this. And let me just speak, if you're still interested, let me speak a little bit more to the other brands I've owned. Here's what I've run into with Panasonic. You're spending about the same, if not maybe a little bit less, for like the GX85, a little bit less for a kit with the kit lens. And in the case of the GX85, you also get a telephoto lens, although it doesn't go nearly as long as the Canon that I just showed you. So say 400, 450 off the bat, but now you want a portrait lens. Their portrait lens, as in like an 85 millimeter equivalent, goes up to about $250, $300. That's just the way it is. That's what their offering is. It's supposed to be a great lens, but I don't want to spend that much money on a camera that I just spent $400 on. Like, it should, the lenses should be a more equivalent price in line with the cameras. And then if you want something ultra wide, same thing. You're going to spend about $300, if not more, for an ultra wide lens that's going to still perform worse than something you'd put on a camera like this. For the same price, again, about, let's say $150 for that zoom lens I just showed you, and you can also get an ultra wide, the Canon 10 to 18 millimeter. That's an EFS lens, so it's a little bit bigger, but 10 to 18 millimeter lens for under 200. Let's say 180 used, and then you have 16 millimeter to 400 millimeter full frame equivalent covered for 150, let's say 200, so 350 plus the cost of this. You're about $800 in, and you have everything you could ever need for a landscape photography setup. You need a portrait lens. What I just showed you is about $100. Flipping to the other side, with the system that I've kind of invested in, I've had 3 or 4 XT20s, and then I've had one XT2, which both great cameras, enjoy using them. They've got all the physical dials, which is really nice. However, when you start looking at lenses, their kit lens is a great kit lens, the 18 to 55. It has a very wide aperture. So you have an f2.8 to f4.0 aperture, great quality, great performance and all that, but then you spend about $300 on the kit lens alone. If you want a zoom lens, they have two offerings. They just released a third, but it's $800, so we're not even going to include that. They have the 55 to 200 millimeter, which is a great lens and is supposed to have great optics, and it's a little bit larger aperture than usual. And then they have the 50 to 230 millimeter XC lens, which is a great bargain at about $180, but the focus is just terrible. The aperture, the maximum aperture, as in when you're zoomed into 230 millimeters, it only opens up to f6.7, so that's significantly worse performance in low light, as well as focusing and that sort of stuff. All just goes downhill at that point. And then you look at portrait lenses, you're about $250, $300 in. So all that to say, Fuji, you're going to spend $1,000 and still be lacking some lenses. Panasonic, you're going to spend $1,000 and either be lacking some lenses or lacking some performance compared to $1,000 spent on this system. To speak a little bit to Sony, I've used Sony cameras for my job. I work at a church and we do live streaming in the midst of this pandemic, and we have an A6400, two A6400s and an A6000. They do great video, they have incredible autofocus, photo quality is good, good low light performance, technically a little bit better than this. Same problem. If you want any lenses, they're going to cost you. They're going to cost you way more than this. Their budget APS-C zoom telephoto lens is a 55 to 210 or 50 to 210, so not as long, darker aperture. It's f6.3, I believe, and it's just a lower quality image. The glass just isn't as nice. And then if you want something like an ultra wide, you're spending $600 or so for the 10 to 18 millimeter. They have portrait lens offerings that are in a similar price range, but if you can't get anything else, you're probably missing out. I don't know if that's been helpful. If it hasn't, I'm sorry to waste your time. But this, I truly believe, for $1,000, you're not going to get more value than this, and you're not going to get a wider range of uses than this. If you have any questions, if you'd like to see a specific review of either one of these lenses represented here, or you have questions about which lens I'd recommend for a certain use, feel free to leave those comments below. But I appreciate any feedback, and thanks for watching.